There is a quiet tension that appears whenever we compare two things side by side: what we are told and what we can actually see. Most of the time, those two things align perfectly. History explains what we observe, and the evidence supports the story. But every once in a while, the two drift apart. The explanation feels clean and confident, yet the physical evidence seems to tell a slightly different story. And that moment, when observation and narrative begin to diverge, is where curiosity usually begins. Because history is not only written in books, it is also written in stone, in streets, in foundations, and sometimes in the quiet details hiding in old photographs. Across the world, cities preserve traces of their past in ways that historians sometimes struggle to fully explain. We see buildings that appear older than their documented construction dates. We see windows sitting below modern street level. We see buried doorways, sealed tunnels, and fragments of infrastructure that seem to belong to earlier versions of the same city. None of these observations automatically contradict history. Cities evolve, streets rise, buildings are renovated, rebuilt, or repurposed. Over long periods of time, entire districts can change shape. But sometimes the scale of those changes invites a closer look. Take, for example, the strange phenomenon of buried architecture. In many cities, especially those that grew rapidly during the 19th century, entire lower floors of buildings now sit beneath the street. Windows appear at ground level, even though they clearly belong to deeper floors. Decorative stonework disappears into the pavement. The usual explanation is simple. Street levels gradually rose over time. Layers of infrastructure were added. Roads were repaved again and again. Eventually, what had once been ground level became partially underground, and that explanation is often correct. But when you start comparing cities across different countries, something interesting happens. The same architectural pattern appears again and again. Rows of buildings with buried windows. Entire entrances that once faced the street, now sealed beneath it. Basements that look suspiciously like former ground floors. In some places, these features stretch across entire blocks, which raises a question that is surprisingly difficult to answer clearly. If street levels rose gradually over centuries, where are the records of these massive transformations? Raising the ground level of an entire district is not a small project. It requires enormous amounts of fill material, extensive labor, and a long period of construction. Such projects usually leave detailed documentation behind. Yet when researchers search the archives of certain cities, the evidence of these large-scale elevation projects can be strangely limited. Sometimes the records exist, but are fragmented. Sometimes the explanations appear decades after the transformations themselves. And sometimes the physical structures seem to preserve a story that no longer appears in the official narrative. This does not mean history is wrong, but it does remind us that history is incomplete. Another example appears when we examine early photographs from the 19th century. Photography arrived just as many cities were undergoing rapid transformation during the industrial era. The camera suddenly captured places that had existed for centuries, but had rarely been documented visually before. When we study these photographs carefully, we sometimes see cities that appear remarkably developed for their time. Large public buildings, complex infrastructure, wide boulevards and stone architecture that suggest long periods of planning and construction. Yet the historical narrative often describes those same cities as having grown extremely rapidly during that exact period. Again, this is not impossible. The 19th century was a time of incredible technological change. Railroads, new engineering methods, and industrial materials allowed cities to expand quickly. But when you compare the photographs with the timelines, the pace of development can occasionally feel astonishing. Entire districts appear to emerge almost fully formed within a generation. And that observation leads to a simple but powerful question. What exactly existed before the moment when photography began documenting these cities? Because cameras rarely capture the beginning of a story. They usually arrive somewhere in the middle. Another layer of this puzzle appears beneath the surface of modern cities. Archaeologists working on subway systems, infrastructure projects, or new building foundations often discover earlier streets hidden below the current ones. In Rome, this is expected. The city is famous for its layers of history. Medieval roads rest on top of ancient Roman ones. Renaissance buildings stand above structures that are thousands of years old. But similar discoveries occur in cities that are not usually considered ancient. In London, excavations have uncovered entire Roman roads buried beneath modern neighborhoods. In New York, construction workers occasionally encounter older foundations and tunnels from earlier phases of the city. In Montreal, parts of the old city remain preserved beneath modern infrastructure. Cities, it turns out, have a habit of building over themselves. And once you realize this, the landscape begins to look different. The ground beneath your feet may contain several earlier versions of the same place. Street by street, foundation by foundation, cities evolve in layers. What we see today is usually just the most recent surface. Personally, I find this perspective both fascinating and humbling. It reminds us that urban history is rarely as simple as a single timeline. It is a process of accumulation. Each generation modifies the environment it inherits, leaving traces that later generations may struggle to interpret. Sometimes those traces are obvious, sometimes they are hidden, and sometimes they create small contradictions between what we are told and what we can physically observe. But those contradictions are not necessarily problems. They are invitations. They encourage us to look closer at the world around us, to notice the details in old photographs, to examine the architecture of familiar buildings, to ask why certain features exist even when their purpose is no longer obvious. History becomes much more interesting when we allow ourselves to explore these questions. Because the truth is that cities are never finished. They are constantly being rewritten. Buildings are demolished and replaced. Streets are raised and lowered. Infrastructure appears, disappears, and reappears again in new forms. Over time, the narrative of a city becomes a layered story where observation and explanation do not always align perfectly. And when that happens, curiosity begins to fill the gap. What we are told gives us one perspective. What we can see offers another. Somewhere between those two perspectives lies the deeper story of how cities truly evolve. And perhaps the most interesting part is that the evidence is still all around us, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to notice it. I never set out to question the foundations of British history. Like most people, I accepted the story as it was presented. A great cathedral, designed by a brilliant architect, surviving war, fire, and time itself. St. Paul's Cathedral stands at the heart of London, not just as a building, but as a symbol of endurance, of continuity, of a history we are told is settled and complete. But history has a habit of changing when the ground opens up. After the Second World War, London was not merely rebuilding, it was excavating. Bombs had torn open streets, collapsed structures, and exposed layers of the city that had not seen daylight for centuries. Beneath the rubble, engineers and workers encountered the buried skeleton of London itself. Roman walls, medieval cellars, forgotten tunnels. This was expected. London has always been a city built on its own past. What was not expected was what lay beneath one of its most famous landmarks. In 1947, engineers began a series of excavations beneath St. Paul's Cathedral. Officially, the purpose was routine. Assess the damage caused by wartime bombing, examine the foundations, ensure the long-term stability of the structure. Nothing mysterious, nothing controversial. Just post-war reconstruction and sensible engineering. That is the official explanation. But buried within administrative notes, engineering memoranda, and fragmentary records are references that tell a different story. Mentions of structural elements that did not align with known construction phases. Notes describing foundations that appeared unusual. Chambers that extended deeper than expected. Stonework that did not resemble Roman, medieval, or even early modern techniques. At first, these references seem insignificant, easy to dismiss. A line here, a comment there. But when placed together, they form a pattern that is difficult to ignore. A pattern suggesting that beneath St. Paul's Cathedral lies something that does not comfortably fit within the timeline we have been taught. This is not a story about legends or lost civilizations whispered about on the fringes of history. It is a story rooted in physical evidence, in stone, in geometry, in engineering decisions made long before the modern era, yet displaying a level of precision that raises uncomfortable questions. The image of St. Paul standing intact amid the flames of the Blitz is one of Britain's most powerful wartime symbols. But symbols have two sides. What rises above the smoke draws our attention. What lies beneath it often goes unnoticed. Operation Unearthing, as these post-war excavations came to be informally known, opened a brief window into what lies below the surface of official history. A window that once opened was quickly closed again. Chambers sealed, access restricted, documentation minimized or lost. The question is not whether something extraordinary was found. The surviving records suggest that it was. The real question is why those discoveries were never fully explored, never publicly examined, and never allowed to reshape the story of one of Britain's most important monuments. Because once you begin to examine what lies beneath St. Paul's Cathedral, the foundations of the narrative itself begin to shift, and that is where this investigation truly begins. By the time the war ended in 1945, London was a city exhausted. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble. Streets that once carried centuries of history lay open, scarred by craters and collapsed masonry. More than 1 million buildings across Britain had been damaged or destroyed during the bombing campaigns, and London bore the heaviest wounds. What followed was not merely reconstruction, but one of the largest urban recovery efforts in modern history. Rebuilding a city is not as simple as restoring what stands above ground. Before walls can be raised again, foundations must be examined. Stability must be assessed. Weak points identified. In a city like London, this process inevitably meant digging into the past. Layers of history were exposed as engineers, surveyors, and laborers worked to secure damaged structures and prepare them for the future. St. Paul's Cathedral stood at the center of this effort, both symbolically and structurally. Although it survived the Blitz, it did not escape unscathed. Bombs fell nearby, shock waves traveled through the ground, fires burned for days around its perimeter. While the dome remained standing, questions remained about what the bombing had done beneath the surface. A structure of such scale could not be assumed safe without careful examination. In 1947, formal excavation work began beneath St. Paul's Cathedral. Official records describe the operation as a routine structural assessment. Engineers were tasked with inspecting foundations, checking for subsidence, and ensuring that the cathedral would remain stable for generations to come. There was no announcement of an archaeological dig, no expectation of discovery. This was not framed as an exploration of history, but as an act of maintenance. That framing matters, because when an excavation is classified as maintenance rather than archaeology, the standards of documentation change. The goal is not to uncover the past, but to secure the present. Findings are evaluated based on whether they pose a risk to the structure above, not whether they challenge historical understanding. Anything deemed irrelevant to stability can be bypassed. Anything inconvenient can be sealed. London's long history meant that engineers expected to encounter older layers beneath the cathedral. Roman remains would not have been surprising. Medieval foundations from earlier incarnations of St. Paul's would have aligned neatly with existing records. In fact, parts of the medieval cathedral were already known to exist beneath the current structure, preserved and documented as part of the site's history. But as work progressed, engineers encountered elements that didn't fit into any of these expected categories. Surviving administrative notes refer to structural features that were described as unexpected. Foundation work extending deeper than documented plans indicated. Stone construction that did not resemble known Roman or medieval techniques. Chambers beneath the crypt that were not accounted for in architectural drawings or historical records. At first, these observations appear minor. Any large building accumulates modifications over centuries. Repairs, reinforcements, additions. It would be easy to assume that these features were the result of undocumented work carried out during earlier restorations. But that explanation becomes less convincing the more closely the details are examined. The materials themselves raised questions. The stone blocks encountered beneath the cathedral were described as massive and precisely cut. Not the irregular masonry typical of medieval construction. Not the layered concrete and rubble associated with Roman engineering. The joints between stones were unusually tight. Surfaces were smooth and consistent. The workmanship suggested careful planning and execution rather than improvisation. More unusual still were the chambers themselves. These were not simple voids created by subsidence or erosion. They were engineered spaces, vaulted ceilings, symmetrical layouts, structural features designed to distribute weight efficiently through the surrounding masonry. Everything about them suggested intentional design rather than accidental formation. This presented a problem. According to the accepted timeline, St. Paul's Cathedral was constructed between 1675 and 1710 under the direction of Sir Christopher Wren. Wren's work is extensively documented. His correspondence, drawings, and published writings provide detailed insight into his methods and philosophy. The tools available to his builders are known. The limits of 17th century construction technology are reasonably well understood. And yet, the structures encountered beneath the cathedral appeared to exceed those limits. This does not mean that Wren lacked brilliance. Quite the opposite. He was one of the most accomplished architects and thinkers of his time. But brilliance does not eliminate practical constraints. Stone must still be quarried, transported, shaped, and positioned. Measurements must still be taken. Loads must still be calculated, using the tools and knowledge available at the time. The foundations beneath St. Paul's suggest a level of precision that implies more than theoretical understanding. They suggest practical capability that is difficult to reconcile with the documented methods of the 17th century. Faced with this inconsistency, one would expect a thorough investigation, detailed surveys, photographic documentation, engagement with historians and structural engineers, a clear attempt to understand how these foundations fit into the broader history of the site. But that is not what appears to have happened. The surviving records from the 1947 excavation are sparse. There are references to unexpected features and recommendations for preservation, but little in the way of technical detail. No comprehensive architectural surveys of the chambers, no published analyses explaining their construction, no clear attribution of their origin. Instead, certain areas were sealed. The official justification was preservation and structural safety. Preventing damage. avoiding unnecessary risk, to the cathedral above. On the surface, this explanation is reasonable, but it doesn't address why these particular areas required sealing while others did not. Roman remains were documented and left accessible. Medieval crypts were incorporated into the cathedral's historical narrative. The unusual chambers, however, were closed off. This selective treatment is what transforms a routine engineering project into something more complicated. Because sealing a structure does more than protect it. It removes it from scrutiny. It prevents further examination. It limits what questions can be asked and what answers can be found. And when this happens at one of the most important historical sites in Britain, the implications extend beyond architecture. The excavation beneath St. Paul's occurred during a unique moment in history. Wartime destruction had created access to foundations that would otherwise remain buried. For a brief period, the physical layers of the city were exposed. Decisions made during that window shaped what would be preserved, what would be studied, and what would be forgotten. Operation Unearthing, whether formally named or not, represented such a moment. And moments like this are rare. Once reconstruction begins, the ground is sealed again. Streets are repaved. Buildings was. Opportunities for examination disappear for generations. What remains then are fragments, references in documents, inconsistencies in plans, architectural features that do not quite align with the accepted story. These fragments do not offer definitive answers, but they do something just as important. They raise questions. Questions about who built what lies beneath St. Paul's Cathedral, about when those foundations were constructed, about whether later architects inherited structures they didn't fully understand, and about why, when these questions surfaced in the aftermath of the war, they were not pursued further. This documentary does not begin with conclusions. It begins with context, with the recognition that history is shaped not only by what is discovered, but by what is examined, recorded, and allowed to remain visible. And beneath St. Paul's Cathedral, much was seen, but very little was allowed to remain in view. To understand why the discoveries beneath St. Paul's Cathedral matter, it is necessary to step back and examine the site itself. St. Paul's is not a single building frozen in time. It is the latest structure in a long sequence of cathedrals, each built upon the remnants of those that came before. The ground beneath it has been shaped, rebuilt, and repurposed for nearly 2,000 years. Long before Christopher Wren designed the cathedral we recognize today, this hilltop served as a focal point of religious and civic life. Archaeological evidence suggests that the site was already significant during the Roman occupation of Londinium. While the exact nature of Roman structures on the hill remains debated, fragments of Roman masonry and foundations have been identified in the surrounding area. The hill's elevation made it an ideal location for important buildings, both practical and symbolic. By the early medieval period, the site had become firmly associated with Christianity. A succession of churches rose and fell on this ground, each reflecting the materials, techniques, and priorities of its time. Fires, political upheaval, and changing architectural tastes ensured that no single structure endured indefinitely. Each rebuilding effort reused what could be salvaged from the previous one. Stone was valuable. Foundations were difficult to excavate. Reuse was not just common, it was often essential. The medieval cathedral that preceded Wren's St. Paul's was an enormous structure in its own right. Known as Old St. Paul's, it dominated the London skyline for centuries. Its spire was among the tallest in Europe. Contemporary accounts describe a vast complex with crypts, chapels, and substructures extending beneath the visible building. Much of this medieval cathedral was destroyed during the Great Fire of London in 1666, But destruction does not always mean erasure. Fires consume wood and weaken stone, but foundations often survive. When Wren was commissioned to design a new cathedral after the fire, he did not begin with an empty site. He inherited a landscape shaped by centuries of construction. Historical records confirm that parts of Old St. Paul's foundations were examined, reused, or built over. This was practical engineering. Removing deep stone foundations would have required enormous labor and risked destabilizing the surrounding ground. Wren himself acknowledged these constraints. His writings reveal a careful balancing act between innovation and adaptation. He wanted to create a structure worthy of the rebuilt city, but he also had to work within the physical limits imposed by what already existed beneath the surface. The visible cathedral reflects his Baroque vision. The unseen foundations reflect compromise. This layered history complicates any simple explanation of what lies beneath St. Paul's. When engineers excavated in 1947, they were not uncovering a single moment in time, but an accumulation of many. Roman fragments, medieval masonry, early modern repairs. Each layer carries its own assumptions about technology and capability. However, this complexity also creates a problem. If unusual structures are found beneath the cathedral, it becomes tempting to attribute them to one of these known phases. Roman engineering was advanced for its time. Medieval builders possessed remarkable skill. Early modern architects like Wren pushed boundaries. On the surface, there is always a plausible explanation available. But plausibility is not the same as certainty. Roman construction beneath London typically relied on concrete, rubble cores, and brick-faced masonry. It was robust, but rarely precise in the way later stonework is described beneath St. Paul's. Medieval foundations, while massive, often display irregular stone sizes and variable alignment. They reflect skilled craftsmanship, but not standardized precision. Wren's documented methods, while sophisticated, were constrained by the tools of the 17th century. The structures encountered during the post-war excavations do not fit neatly into any of these categories. This is not a claim that they belong to an unknown civilization. It is a recognition that their characteristics sit uncomfortably between known phases. Too precise for medieval masonry, too refined for Roman foundations, too advanced, in some respects, for documented 17th century methods. Adding to the confusion is the incomplete nature of the historical record. While the visible history of St. Paul's is well documented, much less attention has been paid to what lies beneath. Foundations are rarely celebrated. Subterranean spaces do not feature prominently in architectural histories unless they are easily accessible or visually striking. As a result, gaps persist. Old plans of the cathedral complex often focus on what was intended to be built, not what was inherited. Modifications made during construction are not always recorded in detail. Repairs carried out in later centuries are sometimes noted only briefly, if at all. Over time, this creates ambiguity. Ambiguity allows assumptions to take root. By the mid-20th century, many of these assumptions had hardened into accepted fact. St. Paul's was understood as Wren's creation. Its foundations were assumed to be appropriate for its era. There was little incentive to revisit these assumptions unless something forced the issue. The bombing of London did exactly that. When explosions cracked open streets and destabilized buildings, engineers were compelled to look beneath the surface. Foundations that had been ignored for centuries suddenly became matters of public safety. It was in this context, not as part of a grand archaeological initiative, that the unusual features beneath St. Paul's came into view. This distinction matters. Archaeological investigations are driven by questions. Engineering assessments are driven by risk. The goal is not to understand the past, but to prevent collapse. Anything that does not threaten stability can be set aside. And so, when engineers encountered structures that were puzzling but not immediately dangerous, there was little institutional pressure to pursue deeper explanations. The war had ended, resources were limited. The priority was rebuilding, not rewriting history. Yet the background matters because it shows how easily unusual discoveries can be absorbed into existing narratives without challenge. A complex site makes anomalies easier to dismiss. Layers become excuses. Uncertainty becomes normal. But complexity does not explain everything. At some point, the differences in construction technique, precision, and design must be accounted for. The background of St. Paul's reveals that reuse and adaptation were common. It also reveals that each historical phase had identifiable characteristics. When structures fail to match any of those characteristics, they demand closer attention. By the time the 1947 excavations were underway, St. Paul's had already passed through Roman, medieval, and early modern hands. Each left its mark. What the engineers encountered beneath the cathedral added another mark, one that did not come with a clear label. Understanding this layered history does not solve the mystery beneath St. Paul's Cathedral, but it does clarify why the mystery exists. It shows that the site is not a blank slate. It shows why assumptions were made. And it shows how, in the absence of detailed investigation, questions can be quietly buried beneath the weight of accepted history. With this background in place, the focus now shifts from context to contradiction, from what we know to what does not align. And that brings us to the point where routine excavation becomes something more unsettling. By the time excavation beneath St. Paul's Cathedral reached its deeper stages, the work had moved beyond expectation and into uncertainty. Engineers were no longer encountering remnants that could be easily categorized as Roman or medieval. What lay beneath the crypt did not resemble the rough, layered foundations typically associated with early construction phases. Instead, the structures revealed a level of intentional design that forced those involved to slow down and reassess what they were seeing. The first indication that something was unusual came not from dramatic discoveries, but from measurements. Stone blocks beneath the cathedral were found to be unusually consistent in size and shape. Their edges were sharply defined. Their surfaces were smooth. More importantly, the joints between them were remarkably tight. These were not stones loosely stacked to support weight. They were fitted together with care, as if precision had been a priority rather than an afterthought. In several areas, excavation reports describe masonry that appeared finely dressed and regularly aligned. Such language is rare in reference to foundations, which are typically functional rather than refined. Foundations are meant to be hidden. They do not need to impress. And yet, what workers encountered beneath St. Paul's displayed a level of workmanship more commonly associated with visible architecture. As excavation continued, the scale of what lay beneath became clearer. Workers discovered chambers extending deeper than anticipated, far below what the cathedral's plan suggested was necessary. These were not shallow cavities created by later subsidence. They were deliberately constructed spaces, defined by vaulted ceilings and carefully laid stonework. The ceilings followed consistent curves. The walls met the floor at deliberate angles. Nothing about them suggested randomness. The vaulted construction was particularly striking. Vaults are not decorative features beneath a foundation. They are structural solutions. They distribute weight, manage pressure, and increase stability over wide spans. Their presence beneath the cathedral implied careful planning and an understanding of load distribution that went beyond simple support. Measurements taken during the excavation indicated that some chambers exceeded 3 meters in height. Their proportions followed symmetrical layouts. The placement of supporting elements suggested calculated weight transfer rather than trial and error construction. In other words, these spaces were engineered. What troubled engineers was not just the existence of these chambers, but how they appeared to fit together. The layout suggested coordination. Chambers aligned with one another. Passageways followed consistent axes. Structural elements appeared to relate to one another mathematically as part of a system rather than isolated features. This level of coordination raised immediate questions. Foundations are usually built incrementally, responding to terrain and necessity. What was uncovered beneath St. Paul's appeared pre-planned, as if the builders knew in advance what loads the structure above would impose, as if they were following an established design rather than improvising solutions. The stone itself added another layer of complexity. Some blocks were estimated to weigh several tons. Transporting and positioning such stones beneath an existing structure would have required careful logistics. Aligning them with millimeter-level tolerances would have required accurate measurement and verification throughout the process. This is where comparisons became unavoidable. Roman engineering was advanced, but it relied heavily on concrete cores faced with brick or stone. The precision described beneath St. Paul's does not match typical Roman techniques found elsewhere in London. Medieval foundations were massive but irregular, shaped by hand tools and practical necessity. Their strength lay in bulk rather than precision. 17th century builders, including those working under Christopher Wren, had access to improved mathematical understanding, but their tools remained relatively simple. Yet the chambers beneath the cathedral appeared to combine mass with precision, strength with refinement, practicality with mathematical order. At this point in the excavation, the project could no longer be described as routine. Engineers noted the anomalies. Recommendations were made. Certain areas were flagged for special consideration. And then, quietly, decisions were taken that would shape the future of what lay beneath St. Paul's. Some chambers were deemed structurally sensitive. Others were labeled as requiring preservation. Access was restricted. Excavation slowed. Areas were backfilled. The work moved on. What is missing from this stage of the record is as telling as what remains. There are no detailed architectural surveys of these chambers. No extensive photographic documentation available to the public. No technical papers explaining how such structures were constructed or why they were necessary. Instead, there are brief references and cautious language. This is the moment where curiosity meets constraint. From an engineering perspective, sealing unusual structures can be justified. Foundations must remain stable. Risk must be minimized. But from a historical perspective, the decision is harder to reconcile. When discoveries challenge expectations, they typically invite investigation. They prompt questions. They attract specialists. Here, the opposite occurred. The excavation beneath St. Paul's Cathedral reached a point where continuing to dig would have required acknowledging that the foundations did not fully align with the accepted narrative. Rather than confront that discrepancy, the operation retreated. The chambers were sealed. The ground was closed. Reconstruction resumed. This decision marks the turning point of the story. Up to this point, everything can be framed as coincidence, complexity, or misunderstanding. But once access is deliberately restricted and documentation thins, the situation changes. The question is no longer simply what was found, but why it was not pursued further. The mini-climax of Operation Unearthing lies here, in the moment when routine engineering crossed into unexplained architecture, when foundations stopped behaving like foundations, when stone began to tell a story that official timelines could not easily accommodate. From this point forward, the investigation cannot rely solely on what is visible. It must turn to patterns, comparisons, and broader context. Because whatever lies beneath St. Paul's Cathedral does not exist in isolation. And that realization opens the door to a much larger question. When confronted with foundations that do not fit comfortably within the accepted historical timeline, there are only a limited number of explanations available. Each has been proposed in some form. Each carries a degree of plausibility. And each, when examined closely, reveals its own limitations. The first and most commonly accepted explanation is straightforward: exceptional craftsmanship. According to this view, the chambers beneath St. Paul's Cathedral represent the peak of human skill achieved with limited tools. Highly trained masons, guided by a brilliant architect, working patiently and precisely, overcoming technological constraints through experience and intuition. This explanation is reassuring. It preserves the established narrative. It requires no revision of timelines or assumptions. Human ingenuity becomes the answer to every inconsistency. But craftsmanship alone does not explain everything. Skill can compensate for crude tools to a degree, but it does not eliminate physical limits. Precision at the scale observed beneath St. Paul's requires consistent measurement. It requires the ability to verify alignment across multiple points and planes. It requires standardized reference systems. Intuition cannot ensure millimeter-level tolerances across massive stone structures hidden deep underground. The question is not whether 17th-century builders were skilled. They clearly were. The question is whether skill alone can produce outcomes that appear engineered rather than approximated. A second explanation points to lost or undocumented techniques. Perhaps builders possessed methods that were never recorded. Perhaps knowledge was transmitted orally through guilds rather than written down. Over time, that knowledge may have been lost, leaving behind structures that later generations could not easily replicate or explain. This idea has merit. History is full of examples where practical knowledge outpaced written theory. But this explanation also raises difficult questions. If such techniques existed and were effective, why did they disappear so completely? Why do we not see gradual degradation or adaptation? Why do later structures, built with improved materials and tools, often lack the same foundational precision? Technological knowledge tends to evolve incrementally. It spreads, it adapts, it leaves traces. Complete disappearance is rare unless something disrupts the system that sustained it. Another possibility is inheritance. Rather than being constructed entirely by Wren's builders, the foundations beneath St. Paul's may represent an earlier phase of construction that was reused and adapted. This is not speculative. Reusing existing foundations was common practice. Builders often worked around what already existed rather than removing it. If earlier structures possessed advanced engineering features, later architects might have incorporated them without fully understanding how they were built. This explanation accounts for several anomalies. It explains why the foundations differ from documented methods. It explains the lack of detailed construction records. And it explains why later builders did not reproduce the same techniques elsewhere. However, it shifts the question rather than resolving it. If these foundations were inherited, who built them? When? And under what technological framework? At this point, the discussion moves beyond St. Paul's Cathedral itself and into a broader pattern observed across Europe. Researchers have identified similar subterranean features beneath cathedrals, civic buildings, and monumental structures in multiple countries. Precision stonework, vaulted chambers, foundation systems that appear standardized rather than site-specific. Individually, these cases can be dismissed as coincidences or local innovations. Collectively, they suggest coordination. This is where the Tartaria hypothesis enters the discussion. it is important to clarify what this hypothesis claims and what it does not. It does not require belief in a single, centralized empire ruling Europe. It does not rely on mythology or legend. Instead, it proposes that a widespread knowledge system once existed, a system capable of producing advanced stone architecture using standardized methods, a system that later societies inherited but did not fully comprehend. Within this framework, structures like the foundations beneath St. Paul's are not anomalies. They are remnants, pieces of infrastructure left behind when the system that created them collapsed or was replaced. Critics argue that this hypothesis is unnecessary. They point to cultural exchange, shared engineering traditions, and the movement of skilled labor across borders. These factors certainly explain similarities in architectural style, but they struggle to explain similarities in hidden engineering solutions, especially when those solutions appear beneath structures built centuries apart. Style travels easily. Engineering precision does not. Precision requires consistency. Consistency requires systems. Systems require infrastructure and shared standards. The question is not whether builders shared ideas, but whether they shared tools, measurements, and methods that produced repeatable results across vast distances. Another objection focuses on documentation. If such a knowledge system existed, where are the records? Where are the plans? Where are the texts describing these methods? This is a valid question, but it assumes that all significant knowledge survives in written form. In reality, history is shaped by what is preserved, not by everything that existed. Wars, regime changes, cultural shifts, and deliberate suppression can all erase records while leaving physical structures intact. Stone endures. Paper does not. The foundations beneath St. Paul's Cathedral are physical evidence. They exist regardless of interpretation. They demonstrate capabilities that require explanation. Whether one accepts the Tartaria framework or not, the problem remains the same. The accepted narrative does not fully account for what is observed. It is also important to recognize the social context in which these discoveries occurred. Post-war Europe was focused on recovery, not re-examination. Governments sought stability. Institutions sought continuity. Questioning foundational narratives at such a moment would have been disruptive. In this context, minimizing anomalies becomes understandable. Sealing chambers becomes practical. Writing vague reports becomes convenient. Reconstruction moves forward, and uncomfortable questions are postponed indefinitely. Theories exist to explain what lies beneath St. Paul's Cathedral. None are definitive. Each leaves gaps. But the presence of multiple imperfect explanations points to a deeper issue. The historical narrative we rely on may be incomplete. This documentary does not claim to resolve that incompleteness. It does not offer a final answer. Instead, it highlights the limits of our explanations and the assumptions that shape them. When foundations refuse to align with history, we have two choices. We can force them into existing frameworks, or we can accept that those frameworks may need revision. The choice determines whether the chambers beneath St. Paul's remain curiosities or become evidence. When the excavation beneath St. Paul's Cathedral concluded, the ground was closed, the chambers sealed, and the city moved on. Reconstruction continued. Streets were repaved. Scaffolding came down. The cathedral resumed its place in London's skyline, as if nothing beneath it had ever been questioned. From the surface, history appeared intact. The official explanation for sealing sections of the excavation has always been practical. Structural stability, preservation, risk management. These are reasonable concerns, especially beneath a building as important as St. Paul's. Foundations must be protected. Excessive investigation can weaken what it seeks to understand. From an engineering standpoint, restraint makes sense. But engineering explanations do not exist in isolation. They exist alongside choices. And choices reveal priorities. Roman remains beneath London are widely documented. Medieval crypts beneath St. Paul's are accessible and incorporated into guided tours. These structures are celebrated as part of Britain's long and layered past. They reinforce the accepted narrative. They fit comfortably within it. The chambers associated with unusual construction techniques did not receive the same treatment. They were not opened to scholars. They were not studied publicly. They were not photographed extensively for archival purposes. Instead, they were sealed, described briefly, and removed from view. Over time, references to them faded into obscurity. This raises a simple question that resists simple answers. Why were these particular structures treated differently? If the chambers beneath St. Paul's Cathedral represented an extraordinary achievement of 17th century engineering, they would strengthen Britain's architectural legacy. They would demonstrate the brilliance of Christopher Wren and the craftsmen who worked under him. They would serve as evidence of advanced capability, not contradiction. Yet they were not presented that way. One explanation is caution. Authorities may have feared damage to the cathedral. Another is distraction. Post-war Britain faced enormous challenges: housing shortages, economic recovery, social change. Revisiting historical assumptions may have seemed unnecessary, even indulgent. But these explanations do not fully account for the pattern, because St. Paul's is not alone. Across Europe, post-war excavations beneath bomb-damaged cities revealed similar anomalies. Foundations that appeared older, deeper, and more precise than expected. Vaulted chambers beneath structures attributed to later periods. Engineering features that did not align neatly with documented methods. In many cases, these discoveries followed the same trajectory. Initial recognition, brief documentation, decisions to seal and stabilize, reconstruction above ground, silence below it. Individually, each case can be dismissed. Collectively, they suggest something systemic. It is tempting to interpret this pattern as evidence of deliberate concealment. But intent is difficult to prove. Bureaucracies do not need conspiracies to suppress questions. They only need incentives to avoid them. Stability, continuity, the preservation of accepted narratives. History is not only shaped by what is discovered, but by what is allowed to matter. The foundations beneath St. Paul's Cathedral still exist. They have not vanished. They remain where they were found, enclosed in stone and earth, supporting a structure that millions admire without ever seeing what lies below. The physical evidence endures, even if the explanations do not. What has changed is access. Without access, investigation becomes speculation. Without documentation, evidence becomes fragmentary. And without willingness to question established timelines, anomalies become footnotes rather than catalysts for understanding. The Tartaria hypothesis is one attempt to explain this gap. It may be incomplete, it may be flawed, it may overreach, but its persistence speaks to a deeper issue, a dissatisfaction with explanations that stop short of the evidence. You do not need to believe in a lost civilization to recognize that something beneath St. Paul's Cathedral does not sit comfortably within the historical framework we rely on. You only need to accept that the story, as currently told, leaves unanswered questions. Questions about capability. Questions about inheritance. Questions about why certain discoveries are remembered while others are quietly sealed away. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is not that history has been deliberately hidden, but that it has been simplified. That complexity has been reduced for the sake of coherence. That foundations were absorbed into narratives that made sense at the time, even if they did not fully explain what was found. St. Paul's Cathedral stands today as a monument to endurance. Fire did not destroy it. War did not bring it down. Time continues to pass around it. But endurance is not the same as understanding. Beneath the cathedral, the foundations carry their own history. One written in stone rather than words. One that resists easy classification. One that challenges us to look beyond surface narratives and consider how much of the past remains unseen. The bombing of London opened the ground. The excavations revealed something unexpected, and then the ground was closed again. What remains is not proof of a forgotten empire, but proof of unanswered questions. And perhaps that is the most honest ending possible, because history does not end where certainty begins. It begins where curiosity refuses to stop. And perhaps that is the true legacy of what lies beneath St. Paul's Cathedral. Not a hidden empire, not a definitive alternative history, but a reminder that the past is rarely as complete as we believe. History, as it is taught, depends on what survives, on what is documented, on what is permitted to remain visible. Foundations, by their nature, are not meant to be seen. They are built to support, not to explain. And when they challenge the stories built above them, they are often treated as inconveniences rather than invitations to understand. The chambers beneath St. Paul's still exist. They have not been destroyed. They have not collapsed. They continue to bear the weight of one of the most iconic structures in Europe. Whatever their origin, whatever their purpose, they remain functional, silent, unresolved. And silence is not the same as absence. The post-war excavations offered a rare moment when those foundations became accessible. A brief interruption in the continuity of the city, when the ground itself was open to inspection. What was seen during that moment was deemed unusual enough to record, but not important enough to pursue. The opportunity passed. Reconstruction continued, and the questions were left behind. Perhaps future excavations will reopen what was sealed. Perhaps new methods will allow us to examine what lies beneath without disturbing what stands above. Or perhaps these foundations will remain closed indefinitely, known only through fragments of reports and second-hand references. What matters is not whether a single explanation prevails, but whether questions are allowed to exist at all. Because once we stop asking why certain discoveries are sealed, minimized, or forgotten, we stop practicing history. We begin repeating it. This documentary is not an endpoint. It is a starting point. If you are curious about what lies beneath other monuments, if you have encountered similar anomalies in historical records or architectural studies, or if you believe that foundations deserve as much attention as facades, then this investigation continues. In the next chapter, we will examine other post-war excavations across Europe, where similar discoveries were made beneath cathedrals, civic buildings, and grand structures, and ask whether St. Paul's is an exception or part of a much larger pattern. Until then, look carefully at the monuments around you. History is not only written in books. Sometimes it is buried beneath them.